What does the future of policing look like in America? Well, right now, there's a nationwide outcry for real systemic change when it comes to law enforcement, specifically when it comes to accountability and use of force.
And our family has been fighting this fight for the past 29 years.
And now we're at a time where all the eyes of the world are watching what we're gonna do. So there is a chance for real change to be implemented when it comes to use of force, but we all have to be on the same page in order for this to happen. Now, we recognize that this discussion is one discussion of a much bigger picture and puzzle that needs to be solved, but it's a very important discussion because even a very good cop with insufficient training is a liability waiting to happen.
So the question is, what is the core principle in law enforcement that we can change, that will impact all the circumstances that we see today?
Police escalation tactics need to become police de-escalation tactics.
This is so major, you guys. This is the core of everything. In order to understand what we're talking about and what we're going to demonstrate today in terms of actual tactics, you have to understand the language of law enforcement, some aspects of the language, especially when it comes to the use of force continuum. Very briefly, and we've talked about this at great length in other videos. The way it works is this: based on the level of threat or the behavior of a subject that a law enforcement officer is interacting with, police officers are allowed to use different levels of force. And just to give you an idea, someone can be compliant, they can be passively resistant, they can be actively resistant, they can be assaultive, and then they can be insultive with the possibility of extreme bodily harm or death, which essentially warrants deadly force. And we've all seen examples of that, right? By suspects using this level of force against officers. Each one of these levels of force by the subject that they're dealing with warrants a different response and a range of responses by the officers in a particular department. Now, each department has a different use of force continuum, so some response techniques will fall in different places based on the specifics of that department, but by and large, each department has these tiers, and each tier has a range of possible responses. Now, what we know and what needs to be understood by the public and what needs to be understood by law enforcement and accepted by law enforcement is that the general tendency for law enforcement is when something happens, let's say indicator or threat level A happens, officer can respond with B or C. And then if D happens, they can respond with E or F. And by the very nature of their responses, they're escalatory. These are escalation. In other words, you bring this, I'm gonna bring more back to neutralize your threat level. If you bring this, we're gonna bring more back to neutralize it. So in a simple sense, it's fighting fire with more fire.
Even though the idea is to de-escalate, they might even have that intent.
Yes.
To not make things worse, but how can you not make things worse when you add a little fire? Even if it's a little bit, it's still fire.
And the tactic of de-escalation exists in departments. They talk about de-escalation. They want to do it, and they use their force, and then they use some verbal. Hey, calm down, stop resisting, give me your arm. But then the person doesn't move for a few seconds, and then they throw more punches. And it's tricky to get the balance between the force and the verbal de-escalation.
That's what it is.
That's where it gets a little tricky, and we have lots to talk about.
So from a de-escalation perspective, in most departments where de-escalation does live, it lives in the form of talking. But it needs to permeate all the physical tactics as well. So de-escalation can't just be something to say, hey, please cooperate and I'll let you go or I won't put so much pressure. The actual physical techniques used against suspects need to be de-escalatory by nature if we're going to ever arrive at a place where when something happens, an officer isn't just looking for what's the highest level of force I'm justified in using right now. Because, right, their use of force continuum might justify this. And if they're going straight to that, that's a problem. Because the public looks at that and says, wow, he was only doing that and you guys did that. That to them wasn't acceptable. And now we get it. A lot of times the public or someone watching or on a cell phone doesn't have all the details. But at the very nature, if someone doing something causes a escalatory response from a law enforcement officer, it's only gonna keep getting worse. Not just in those individual interactions, but for the nation as a whole. But if we can change tactics to where when something happens, we look to neutralize that with a lower level of force. Is it possible to neutralize fire with water instead of more fire?
And the answer is yes. And we qualify so greatly to speak on this because we have generations and generations of training of jiu-jitsu. And when we think about these situations that officers find themselves in and they throw fire, which are, there are many examples of fire in law enforcement, but we're talking about using water.
Yes.
And water can be seen in the form of control.
Yes.
And we are masters of control, of keeping ourselves safe from the harm that a potential person in the street or a suspect or somebody might attack us. We defend ourselves using control. And that same control is what is lacking in law enforcement.
Now, you said we're masters of control, and yes, we are. But it does not require too much mastery of the principles that we'll be discussing today in order to become proficient at the skills that we are discussing. You see, this whole idea that you need to be a black belt, you need to train for 10 years, 7 years, it's not necessarily the truth. As long as you're in the path of the control, in the path of mastery, in the path of water, you are on the right path.
There you go.
And there are many departments right now that have already been through GST, that are already learning jiu-jitsu, that are using these control tactics, and it's been very successful.
And that's something we're going to show some techniques right now, but it's important to recognize every department stands alone. They all have their own training, procedures, use of force continuum, tactics that they pursue, courses, progressive training. They're all on their own. So we try not to speak too broadly in that every department is deficient or every department is proficient. We're just saying that by and large, we've been doing it for 29 years, but we haven't done enough. We need to do more, and that's the quest that we're on. And we're going to demonstrate that now, because here's the ultimate challenge. When you are undertrained with hands-on control tactics, and ultimately the water to the suspect's fire is going to be based on control. When you're undertrained in actual hands-on control tactics, naturally you're going to escalate and over-rely on your tools. Pepper spray, baton, taser, firearm. So undertraining leads to over-reliance on physical tools. And listen, they might have 3 or 4 tools, but we all know the saying. When all you have is a hammer, everyone is a nail. So our objective is to increase the level of police training so every officer has more tools hands-on that will allow them to put out serious fires with water. Now, we must recognize that some fires can only be put out with the absolute mother blaze comes over and you just overwhelm it. We recognize that. So we're not saying that deadly force is never justified or a higher level of force might not be necessary. What we're saying is that when a threat can be neutralized with the lowest level of effective force based on proper training, should that be the case? And should it be the default that officers are aiming to de-escalate before they escalate to the justifiable
As long as we
level.
can escalate later, we can use these techniques. Yes.
There you
as
go.
Long as we can
So
go back.
we're trying to add an option to the tool belt of these officers. And that option is the very body that they were born with, but most of them are grossly undertrained in utilizing, which is so sad because the best tool we have is our body. And it's the most underutilized in law enforcement. Should we show some positions?
Yes.
We have to.
Yes.
Hidon, you're the officer, you're the suspect. Check this out. Hidon, you're on your mounted and the officer is on the bottom. Sorry, officer on top, suspect is down. Move a little closer. Check this out. So let's paint a very simple situation for you guys. The officer is mounted, controlling, putting hip pressure hooks in. In this situation, the officer has control, the suspect is down. The suspect is obviously fighting, resisting. The officer had to take him down and control him. Now here's the deal. Everything can change if the suspect goes for the officer's gun. Freeze. Don't move. Right here, the suspect is showing, right, the intent to, he's assaultive, he's fighting the officer, and he's showing, right, lethal intentions by reaching for the officer's gun, right? In almost every jurisdiction, a jury would say, yes, he went for the gun, that's serious threat, he could kill the officer. So if I was the partner here, I would be justified in shooting him because he's about to take my partner's gun and shoot us both. So that would be a lethal force, justifiable, level 4, level 5 threat scenario. If you don't have any tools, that's what would happen. But let's go start over, you're mounted, and let's watch what would happen. Go for the gun, Evandro. Look, go for the gun, Evandro. Here, go. Look, go for the gun, Evandro. Grab his gun, for real. For real.
Throw him off.
Throw him off, Evandro. Look at this, you guys. So it's called double underhook mount control with super hooks on the backside here. Elbows are flared for weapon retention. Can you grab his gun right there?
No, I can't.
Impossible, because Hidon's elbows are flared and his fists are up above his head with the S grip over the head.
How much energy are you spending over there, Hidon?
Very little energy.
Very little energy. All he has to learn is hooks and hip pressure, and the fact that when someone goes for the gun, you underhook on the side, and if he goes for the taser, you underhook on the same side. Now, if I'm the partner and I walk up and I see this level of control, and I pull my gun out to shoot the suspect. Hidon, what would you say to the officer over here?
Looks, I got this.
No need. There's no need.
Take your gun out.
This is not a lethal force situation anymore, but the only thing that changed this from a lethal force justifiable situation for Hidon to a non-lethal control, neutralize the threat, de-escalate, put out this fire with water. The only thing that changed that is the knowledge of the officer to use his body or her body in a way that they had not previously learned. Another position?
I love it.
Watch how simple. So that's from the mount, weapon retention from the mount. Deadly force went down to intermediate control, hip pressure, underhook. Let's go from the side mount.
Side mount.
Yeah, same position.
Switch sides.
Yeah, sure. So same thing, side mount, let's flip it 90 degrees. Look at this. This is called side mount. So Hidon is side mounted on Evandro, a great control position. Evandro, check his base a little bit. Check, 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 check. Look, and at this point, if he shows any attempt to grab the weapon right there, go ahead. Look what he does. 1, 2. Grab the gun, Evandro. Grab the gun. You guys, exact same technique, different position. So now Hidon has an underhook. From the side mount, he's sprawled out. The weapon is inaccessible. At this point, he may walk it up so high. Look at this, he can trap the arm right here around the neck. But the fact is, Evandro went for the weapon. Deadly force was justifiable. It doesn't mean it was necessary. Hidon, mount on him, let's roll to guard. So full mount. Let's say from here, the suspect is so strong that he rolls Hidon off. So you fall off to the side, he rolls Hidon to the side, and look, now we end up in this situation. We're in the guard, Hidon block punches, stay close, everything's staying close. At this point, if he's block punching Hidon can simply manage the distance and manage the damage. In a fight, whoever manages the distance manages the damage. So he's neutralizing distance so Evandro can't punch him. If Evandro goes for the gun, watch what he's gonna do. Grab the gun, Evandro. No more gun. Look at it. He locks S grip behind the back. Double under. What does this look like, you guys? It looks like the exact same thing you just saw from the mount, except it's the upside down mount called the guard. Double underhooks S grip. Backup is on its way. And when I show up, he's safe. I come in. I help arrest the suspect here. We work together to do that. No more access to the firearm.
So it's important to mention that we are doing incidental contact. There's two kinds of grip. Incidental contact, in which he can early address the grip is not too tight, and the committed grip. We have techniques for different grips, but right now it's the early identification of it and prevention.
The point is, the suspect has shown intention.
Yes.
And if the suspect has shown intention, in this case, this is what's so important for the world to understand. It would be articulatable and justifiable to use lethal force if I was the outside partner seeing this, or Hidon, if he could draw his weapon first, because the suspect has shown. And the point is, learning these tactics doesn't just increase the officer's survivability, it also increases the suspect's survivability. Gracie's survival tactics, the survival isn't exclusive to law enforcement. Gracie's survival tactics, GST, it's also 50% priorities for the law enforcement survivability, 50% priority is for the suspect, for the community, for the people's survivability. And that's something that people don't often realize. Why are you teaching cops jiu-jitsu? What's wrong with you guys? Why are you teaching them how to beat people up? No. Why? We're teaching them because we know that a trained officer has more options to put out an aggressive subject with water, put out the fire with water before resorting to what may be inevitably necessary, but isn't always necessary, and most cases isn't necessary, putting the fire out with water.
You know what is interesting right now? That even though the officers and the GST program is focused on both people's survival, it's better for everyone. Of course, for the suspect that's being taken care of, but for the officer to take care of the suspect is an automatic response of them taking care of themselves.
Interesting.
Because I deal with fire, a building on fire with water, it's safer for the firefighters.
Right.
You see? So it's a win for the officer, win for the suspect, back win to the officer, which is back to win to the suspect.
That's a great point.
Water is the answer.
Putting out a fire with more fire is dangerous for the initial fire recipient, but also for the deliverer of the additional fire. When you introduce a firearm into the fight, when Hidon draws his weapon to then use it. Let's give the other example.
Whose firearm is it now that I draw?
It's everyone's firearm now.
Everyone's.
Once you introduce it, it's everyone's. So that's what's wild. By putting out the fire with water, underhooks, weapon retention, he's actually preventing the firearm from being introduced, which would be a liability to himself, which is why so many officers annually who are shot with a firearm oftentimes are shot with their own firearm because it's grappled from them. Now here's what's crazy. Officers are often only given 4 hours a year. Annual in-service training requirement on average is 4 hours per year for training like this. Now, that's a change that we can't make by ourselves. That's government, institutional, law enforcement.
What do you think about the 4 hours?
It's way too little. They need to have way more training, right? They need to have weekly, monthly, quarterly training requirements, but it's budgetary, right? The point I'm gonna make is that 4 hours is very limited. We can't change it, but what we can change is that in those 4 hours, The techniques they need to be learning are, like these, need to be de-escalatory by nature. Yes. So you're teaching the officers not to go to the highest level of justifiable force right away, but rather, what's the lowest level of effective force we can use to accomplish the objective of neutralizing the threat, saving both of our lives, and going home at the end of my shift.
And like
that's top priority.
And like Evandro mentioned, a principle like this underhook technique that we just saw in 3 different positions doesn't take, 2 months to master or 2 years. In an hour of training this right here, you understand very clearly that underhooks help keep weapon retention.
Because we teach via principles, not via techniques. The principle here is simple. You need your arm, officer, between the suspect's arm and your firearm or your tool belt. As long as you get those underhooks and you lock them up, you're good to go. Now, these are the principles: distance management, underhooks for weapon retention. These can all be taught, like Hidon said, in very little time. So even a 4-hour block can save a suspect and an officer's life months, if not years down the road, because they learned a principle, not a technique that can easily be forgotten. There was an incident a few years back in Kansas City where an off-duty police officer was called to an incident where a person got out of a taxi cab, was upset at the taxi driver, punched the driver. So the off-duty but armed and working capacity off-duty law enforcement officer named Donald Hubbard was at the incident. He takes the subject down. This is the aggressive subject. And then what happened was, as a result of him kind of bucking up, then the officer, Donald Hubbard, went in, wrapped his neck a little bit, and then he underhooked on that side and threw him towards us. Boom! And he landed here in this side mount position on the top right here. So now, hammer fists started coming down in eye gouges. Hammer, scratching, punching, punching, punching. Now, these were legitimate strikes. In fact, you see after the fact, he actually had a fractured skull. His orbital socket was fractured, many lacerations to his face, so he was getting pummeled from here, and as a result, he draws his weapon. Officer Hubbard here drew his weapon and fired 2 shots, killing the suspect in this situation. Now here's what's wild. The suspect was Anthony Bruno, was an off-duty firefighter, 26 years old, and it was his wedding night when this incident happened. 2 shots to the chest, he died. Obviously, Officer Hubbard had no idea this was a firefighter, and Anthony Bruno was drunk, had an altercation with the taxi driver, threw a punch.
And the situation was,
and he was getting arrested. He didn't like it. Pressure on the neck got up. The point is this. At this point, Bruno was throwing legitimate strikes and created what was perceived and actually a deadly force situation for Officer Hubbard. And
I can't get knocked out. If the police officer gets knocked out, who knows whose lives are in danger? Not only is my life in danger, my weapon is right here, which then becomes anybody's weapon, and then it's just major problems. So I have to keep myself alive.
There you go. Which is what
he did.
Which is what he did. So they went to a grand jury, and he was released, and there was, it was a justifiable use of lethal force based on the circumstances. And what we're saying is that just because something was justifiable, and this is talking broader now, doesn't mean it's necessary. If training is introduced, what is justifiable and what is necessary often doesn't need to match. For example, hammer fist, go Hidon, what would you do? Go, the legs get introduced in the fight, and right away, already by introducing his legs, Hidon went from a desperate position into a punch protective position because he can control Evandro's posture, and it was the posture of Hubbard that allowed him, of Bruno, that allowed him to strike so freely. There's no more posture right now to punch. And Hidon can control him and neutralize all the strikes from here.
And this comes from an understanding that when you are on your back, if you have to be on your back in a fight, you want the person inside your legs, inside your guard.
Which is not a natural thought unless you receive the training. So right now, Hidon's putting out the fire with water, de-escalation, physical de-escalation tactic of control here. Now, let's just say that Bruno went for the firearm from the guard. He goes with Hidon, curl, connect, and stretch. And there you go. Now, another de-escalation tactic, another fire, another water application, and we're back. Yeah. So what this ultimately boils down to is this. Even good cops are liabilities waiting to happen when they don't have the training, de-escalation, tactical de-escalation, physical techniques. And the reason for this is when you are operating in a conscious, reasonable, action, reaction, if I do this, if then situation, when you're operating in your prefrontal cortex, which is your conscious, rational decision-making part of your brain, where if I do this, I do that, if I do this, it's gonna shoot them, So that's only possible under the circumstances where you have an actual or perceived sense of control. When an officer, even a good one, loses control in an altercation, they're hijacked by the amygdala part of their brain. The amygdala hijack, when it happens, because you have a perceived loss of control, the amygdala hijack, now you're in fight, flight, or freeze. There's no rational decision making. You're in absolute survival mode, which is why they say if someone's drowning, you should go over. The first thing you should do is knock them out. Because even though you're trying to help them, they could drown you because they're panicking, amygdala hijack. Knock them out and then drag them to the shore, because that way you can take care of them better than they're capable of taking care of you and themselves in that situation. What we try to become through training is providing every officer buoys, a floating buoy in the ocean. So even though they might not be the best swimmers in the world, if you're just panicking and there's no buoy, you're gonna drown very quickly. But if there's a buoy to hold on to, your PFC can activate. You can think consciously and safely. Okay, I'm safe right here. Okay, 20 yards that way, there's another buoy. I'm gonna go, it's gonna suck, but when I get there, I can at least rationally decide what I'm gonna do with this subject in this situation. Jiu-jitsu, Gracie Survival Tactics provides buoys of PFC activation where they can remain calm and rational in a life-threatening altercation. The officer needs to be trained that being on their back with someone inside their legs with their arm underhooked is a buoy of safety. And from there, once they build trust in that, they can go to that at any time during an altercation and be able to make better decisions than if the amygdala were to hijack their operation.
It's interesting that based on what you just explained to us, it makes sense why when we are watching some scenarios or watching fights, we often say, right, why isn't he doing that? Why isn't she doing this? You see, even with sports, right, people love to see and question. But once you are there on the eye of the hurricane, things are different based on the
hijack.
And this comes from, I guess, the spectator, the community's belief that when they see the officer, like, why did he didn't have to do that? It comes from the community's belief that the officer is actually very well trained.
Yes.
That he has the buoy there.
Yes, this is the most important misconception that we need to clear up. Keep going.
The officer is not as trained as you think they are, right? They're not getting as much training. We talked about it, 4 hours a year. The fact that we and many officers around the country and just people around the world can be on their backs or on the bottom of a fight in side control and feel that they are in control and feel safe to some degree so that they can stay in their prefrontal cortex, that's a very rare thing. That's the minority. The majority of people, when they fall on their backs, everything goes south, it's a major problem, their life is in danger, and therefore they've lost control, which talks back to about how they go into the lizard brain. And they go wild.
You guys, so the question is, what do we do from here, right? And like I said, we've been doing this for 29 years now, and we're not gonna stop. We're gonna keep pushing forward.
Yep.
But what we find over these years is that in almost every single case, because some people are saying, why isn't every department trained in this? That's the question. Why isn't every department? And maybe to some people's surprise, in almost every single case where a department needs the training but doesn't get it, it is budgetary. Where the end users, the street cops, and even their instructors, the DTAC instructors of the department are 100% committed. We need this training. Our lives are on the line. We want this. We want to know how to control people to save their lives and to save ours. But in almost every case that it doesn't get approved, it's a budgetary constraint where the top, the defensive tactics instructors will go to the chief and say, Chief, we need this training. Chief goes, sorry, it's not in this year's fiscal budget. We can't make it happen, and maybe later. And then 4 or 5 years pass and they never get approved for the training that they so badly need. This is happening. Now, knowing this, we have sponsored countless departments over the years to come do defensive tactics, because we know that when we sponsor a department, we bring, let's say, 2 guys or 2 girls from a police department out in the middle of nowhere. Once they get certified, we're certifying the instructor, so they go back and train the whole department, and then that whole department becomes a GST integrated department. And there are thousands of them, but there are far more departments that are not pursuing and bringing in the more progressive training and control de-escalation tactics than there are ones that have already crossed that threshold.
And Henry, the reason why we sponsor is because we know that money should never be the blockage that will prevent people from getting access to this knowledge.
Absolutely. So the question is, people have reached out to us and said, hey, how can we help? And for the first time, what we've realized and what we're gonna try to facilitate is people who wanna help can sponsor a department. An individual can sponsor a department. Now, that doesn't mean that you need to have 300 people come train with us. Like I said, that means you're probably bringing 1 or 2 instructors, the top instructors from a department, to come to one of our courses nationwide, get certified in how to teach it, then they go back and deploy it for the rest of the crew. And people have asked to do that. We never had the infrastructure in place, but we're gonna be open to that possibility because we're getting to a point where people are fed up. How is it that every police officer doesn't have this training? Well, budgetary constraints, chiefs aren't buying it. Maybe the chief is from a different era, from 20, 30 years ago, and they don't see the need for this type of training. Well, right now, because of everything that's going on, there's a newfound interest in how can we revamp defensive tactics and uses of force at police departments nationwide. And we feel like we have the answer, and many people want to help us distribute that information, and this is one way you can do that. Sponsoring a department, 1 or 2 instructors from a department come, right, get certified, go back and teach the whole department. And if that were to happen, we were to make sure that A, the department were to know who the sponsor is, the sponsor is gonna know who the department is, which department they're actually sponsoring to make this happen, and we can't wait to let the world know who the parties are that are helping us make this happen, to allow more departments to be certified and GST integrated, which will be, it's the future. It has to be the case. It's just a matter of how many lives have to be lost before every single department is offering their officers the tools to be at a core de-escalatory in their interactions versus, you know, hey, he did this, what are we allowed to do? You're allowed to do this, but do you need to do all this is the question. What's justifiable isn't necessarily what's necessary, but the ability to operate at a lower level of force effectively does require knowledge of some sort of how to use your body and not just quickly resort to your tools on your tool belt.
And Henner mentioned at the beginning of the video that this is just one piece of a bigger picture. Now, with this opening that we're doing right now, people from any aspect of this big picture, from any angles, we can all move to the same direction. Because in the bottom of all of us, and everything that has been happening, we all have something in common. And that's just a matter of time for us to find, to align, to create the systems and programs in which you allow everyone to jump in, and we can go all in the same direction, which is what we all call for.
And so much of this is possible in terms of sponsorship, us going in the same direction. So much of it is possible, and even you guys listening to us right now, it's because of your trust in Jiu-Jitsu, in the Gracie family, in Gracie University, whether it's the communities around the world. We have students around the world, police officers around the world, and the success of this course in communities. So thank you to everybody out there who's behind us in this movement, because without you, this is not possible.
Absolutely. So whether you are an individual or an organization who would like to sponsor a department, or you're a department who's been fighting for years to get GST approval to come get certified, but you've been unsuccessful, whether you're a potential sponsorship recipient as a law enforcement department or a potential donor to make the sponsorship possible for a department, please email us at gst@gracieuniversity.com, and we'll share more details, get more into the discussion. And listen, whatever you guys can do, great. Whatever you can't do, great. Just by watching this and sharing this and being part of the discussion, we're gonna keep going all the way.
No matter what.
And no matter what, we're not gonna stop until every single police department is fully GST trained in de-escalation tactics. So we hope you can join us. Thank you guys for watching and for helping spread the good word here.
You guys, one more thing. When it comes to Minneapolis, there's talks right now of dismantling the police department. Now, we don't know what's gonna happen.
But we do know that someone will be placed on that role to protect and serve the community.
And whatever group of people or whatever organization is chosen to protect Minneapolis, we want to make sure that that organization is GST certified. So regardless of other donations or people who want to join the force here and help us sponsor other departments, Gracie University wants to sponsor that organization to make sure that the de-escalation techniques of GST are prevalent in the community relations and interactions of Minneapolis from this point forward. So we got your back. Let's make this happen.